Professor Markakis, thanks for coming here.
You're very welcome.
The Initiate to Ethiopian Studies, those of us who study Ethiopian know your work, you know the reach of your work. You're the most astute observer of the Ethiopian political scene and the most prolific writer, academic writer. Could you tell our viewers about yourself, about your research, and how you came to study Ethiopia?
Well, thanks for the nice words. I've often been asked this question: how did you come to Ethiopia? And it was a completely a coincidence. I was studying in America, I was studying in Colombia, and gradually I shifted into African studies as part of a PhD. And the thing to do then was to go to Africa and to spend some time and then write a book, go back to America and make a career there. This was the path that people took. And the American government had formed a committee which found jobs for American graduates to go to Africa, either to do a PhD, research for a PhD, or to teach and write books. See, at that time, there was very little knowledge about about Africa in America. The French and the others, British had experience, but the Americans had none. So, and then suddenly, as they spread their wings throughout the world, they needed knowledge and skilled people to work in the various departments. And so many people went to Africa, and I did also. But I was intending to go to to Nigeria. This was the time that was very exciting: nationalism in Nigeria, nationalist parties, etc., etc. And Ghana. These were the places where political developments were taking place. And I was scheduled to go to Nigeria, but at the very end, after I had vacated my house and packed everything and had no job in Prospect, the prospect collapsed for some reason, and they told me, sorry, you cannot go to Nigeria. Can I go anywhere else? They said, well, not really, unless you want to go to Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia was the last place in the world I wanted to go, because Ethiopia had no political life at all. No nationalism, no parties, no elections, nothing at all. And in the end, I had to take it because out of desperation. I tried to find something about Ethiopia. Nobody knew anything about Ethiopia except that there was a man called Haile Selassie, who was the emperor, and the war with the Italians, and the war with the Italians early, and so on. And so I did go. And for quite some time I regretted it, because it was such an unusual environment, both as a country, as a society, and the university I was assigned to was mostly in the hands of Jesuits. Mm-hmm. And life was being regimented for the students. And the students by themselves didn't take to me, because I was a typical American graduate in political science. I was giving them lessons how America is governed, checks and balances, and the president and the Congress, and they had not the slightest interest in all these things. They kept asking me, what about revolution? What do you think about the revolution? And I was told not to talk about Ethiopian politics. The department head was an old Polish gentleman of the old world who told me, said, we were not talking about politics, because I saw in the syllabus there was no course on Ethiopia. I said, what? So why do you have a political science department? He said, because all universities have them. Mm. And then I said, well, who teaches them about politics here? He said, nobody. I said, what do you mean? He said, politics are the business of the emperor. People have nothing to do with it. I said, what do the students think about it? And he said, they're not supposed to think. It was the climate. And of course, the students already were ripe revolutionaries there, Marx and Lenin, and what is to be done were the Bibles. And I appeared to be a fairly naive and clumsy teacher. There would be talk in the classroom, and at the end of the classroom, I would stand by my desk, because usually students who come to talk to you, they all marched out without even looking at me. So I was very upset about this, and I talked with some Ethiopian friends I had made in the faculty, young men, and they told me, you were out of luck because you got all the rebels in your class. They were taking political science, you see. So I decided to re-educate myself. I had a crisis in my intellectual development, and I went to Greece and I read the books that they were reading, like Frantz Fanon, The Damned of the Earth. What else? The Mao's booklet on contradictions. This was their Bible, the little red book. So I read all this, and I became conscious of what the problem was. That I decided, instead of teaching them, I would let them teach me. So I went back to the classroom and I opened the thing to discussion. And immediately they jumped in and started telling me about Ethiopia. I said, you know nothing about Ethiopia. I said, what's there to know about Ethiopia? He said, read about our land problem. Read about the feudal system, etc. So I started to read, and gradually I thought, I made such a complicated and unique surviving system of a real medieval type of government that I became gradually fascinated by it. Haile Selassie was the appointed of God. Ethiopians did never look in his face. They didn't dare look him in the face. Whatever he said went. He was a nice man, he was a kind man. But when it came to power, when it came to holding the empire together, he was without unhesitating, and he would kill people and do whatever he was needed. So he was the absolute ruler. He had a cabinet of some dozen educated people, the first educated people in Ethiopia, and he ran the country like that. But behind it was all the ritual, all the fables about the emperor and his powers and his court. He had the highest court. He was a judge. He was the chief religious figure. He was everything. So I started looking into it, and the students realized this. So they started feeding me information. At the same time, all sorts of demonstrations were going on, fighting with the police, and sometimes students being killed, the university being closed most of the time, a very troubled time. And they, at the end of the third year, they had to go to the provinces and do what they call national service. So while doing national service, they started coming back and giving me documents. They stole from the local government offices, and they brought to me. So I got a lot of information on the land issue, and many other things. And that we became very close together. And some of the top revolutionaries, became my friends, because our age difference wasn't great. They came to university fairly late. Because of the struggle, they had to go through the various elementary, secondary, tertiary, very severe selection system. So all these people were unusually able and bright. They were the cream of 25, 35 million population. So we became close friends. Unfortunately, most of them died in the struggle that followed. And by the time I left after 4 years, I was hooked. I wrote that first book called Ethiopia, Anatomy of a Traditional Polity. a very complicated title.
Well, it's been a long time then since I presume that you went to Ethiopia in 1965.
No, I went to 65 and I left in 1969, and then I wrote the book in America while I was in New York, and it came out in the 74.
Correct.
74, yes.
Yeah. So sometimes when people talk about scholars and academics, they say that they have written so many books and numerous articles and book chapters. Sometimes that is inflated, but in your case, I must say that you've written numerous pieces of writing as a form of a book, edited book, articles. That is a fitting description that we have really numerous works. But in my own assessment, it looks like to me that your work is kind of bracketed by these two books. One is the Ethiopia, with the subtitle Anatomy of a Traditional Polity, and then now in 2011, Ethiopia, The Last Two Frontiers. One is the opening salvo, the last one is a synthesis of your work. So let's assume that I am right in characterizing your work as bracketed by these two books.
I think it's a good characterization, yes.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a couple of questions about your approach and what you studied from your students about your first book, Anatomy of a Traditional Polity. You discuss basically the old regime, or Haile Selassie's regime, or the imperial regime in that book. In the book, you stated that your goal was, and I'm going to quote you from your Anatomy of Traditional Polity, says that the desire that you wrote the book because of the desire to penetrate the aura of benevolent paternalism in order to analyze the nature of the Ethiopian political system through the use of concepts currently, meaning at that time, applied in political analysis of developing states. So, while you're describing what you learned from your students, the idea of the benevolent paternalism kind of emerged. It's there. And the two concepts that you're talking about in that book are class and ethnicity. These were the two concepts through the prism of which you were analyzing the Haile Selassie regime. You do demonstrate in the book that a multi-ethnic elite perpetuate the cultural norms of a dominant group, and that's the Amhara in the book. But when you analyze provincial rebellions, that is the periphery rebellion against the center, particularly against the land and tax policies, you seem to downplay the importance of class and ethnicity. In fact, you conclude that the rebellions in Bale, in Gojam, and in Tigray to some extent exemplify the ineffectiveness of imperial rule from the center over the periphery than the resurgence of class and ethnic struggles. Now looking back 40 years later, do you think that the movements were in fact revolts against class and national oppression than ineffective governance at the time?
That's a very good question. I have to think exactly what I said a long time ago. But you're right in the sense that I was saying political development with concepts of current concepts. I was talking like an American graduate in political science. Class was not involved in this, obviously. Class was not taught in the American universities or thought to have anything to do with politics. I focused on the land. I sensed, but also because the first student demonstration was over the land. The students had grasped it from the very beginning. The first violent demonstration was land to the tiller. And this was the fulcrum of the feudal system. So you have to analyze this, and to analyze it, you have to do it through class. How else are you going to analyze? And of course, that's several years after I had first gone to Ethiopia. By that time I had boned up on Marxism, etc. So class was one of the analytical tools. And I talked about class formation in the north, because it was different, and class formation in the south. Now, the resistance to the center, as I pointed out in that, came from the periphery, and it was peasants and pastoralists who were involved. Now, again, you could say that I was following Marx in the sense that peasants have no class consciousness, or pastoralists have any kind of national identity. So I thought ethnicity is the concept we can use there to respond, to explain, for example, why did peasants rebel in Bale? Of course, there were the Amhara on one side and the Oromo on the other, but the energy behind it, the dynamic was the class relation, the land, because the Amharas kept taking the land away from the peasants, and Bale had the worst kind of land structure. They kept taking the land away from them, and that's why they rebelled. So it wasn't simply an ethnic clash out of the blue when everything was peaceful. There was an active process of depriving the local people of the land and livelihood that eventually led to the rebellion. So I do use ethnicity, but it was used, I think, critically, how it merges with other factors, which are material factors, and I still believe that to be the case today. I don't think people fight because they belong to different ethnic groups. Otherwise, Africa would be a chaos. But they do use ethnicity as a mobilizing factor for struggles that have other real material causes.
Okay. So it was really class and ethnicity, and there are instances in human history where class and race or class or ethnic interests overlap.
Right.
So the question was about, was it ineffective government? Well, it was really class oppression and ethnic oppression that precipitated the rebellions. Now, another question on that book, and then we'll move on to the present.
Let me finish on that at one point.
Yeah.
The book makes it very clear that what is the greatest risk to this system is this conjunction of ethnic and class differences. I say that time and time again, and this is exactly what happened.
All right, that's true. Now, during the imperial period, which you deal separately with in your latest book, there was a multinational opposition to the domination of the center, expressed in the form of Maison or EPRP. Well, for all intents and purposes, these were really a multinational opposition to the center, to the domination of the center. But the way I see it, this opposition was crushed by the revolutionary regime. And the Land Act of 1975 also destroyed the socio-economic basis of class contradiction and conflict. So what remained afterwards was the national opposition, the ethnic opposition as a potent force rather than the class opposition. And the imperial regime's policy of assimilation and administrative centralization actually strengthened the national, the centrifugal forces, which in turn actually undid the imperial regime. So my question to you is, do you think that the national question has remained the perennial question, unanswered question in Ethiopian politics that shapes politics in Ethiopia, or has shaped politics in Ethiopia since then, and even informed the shape of the political formation in Ethiopia, that really the national question is a perennial question in Ethiopian politics?
I have to correct you on this. This is a common misunderstanding. The student movement the radical opposition to the regime was not against the center. In fact, they were centrists to the core. They were centrists to the core. Had they taken power, they would have fought just as hard as the Derg. And they're still alive, some of them, and they tell you this is the case. What they wanted to prevent the disintegration of the state, which they saw happening because of the struggles all around the periphery. They wanted to bring reform in order to prevent the disintegration of the center. They were radical Marxists. Radical Marxists are focused on the center, state control of everything. So many people think that they were not Democrats, not by a long shot. So in the sense that the regime collapsed, these people eliminated. And also I would add to that they were not really multi-ethnic in that sense. They wanted to be, they posed, but they were forced to have ethnic sections. You know, both the EPRP, they had a Oromo section and another section, but this was insignificant. They did it only to give the impression of a multi-ethnic composition. Now, what happens after that is again mobilization on a national basis. That's true. Ethnically, national, etc. I don't like to call people like the Oromo, 35 million, an ethnic group. What would that make my country, which is 10 million? I think it's right to call them nationalities or nations. They tried to mobilize on that basis, and they did. The Tigrans were on that basis, the Oromo, the Somali, the Afar, the Sidama, etc. This was they called themselves National Liberation Fronts. National meaning their identity. The only ones who were, interestingly enough, mobilized on a false premises were the Eritreans. The Eritreans, they never existed before, they had no identity as Eritreans. How did they manage this is another story. But they did not have a national basis for mobilization, but they succeeded. So yes, this factor has remained central, yes. Yeah.
Walala was your student.
Sorry?
Walala Makonnen was your student.
Walala Makonnen, yes.
Well, I guess he's the first to enunciate this national question within the student movement. As you said, there were the Oromo section, the ethnic or national sections were within the student movement, and that's probably what makes it multinational or inter-nation opposition. But that was a decisive moment in the student movement, which split the student movement into many sections or the constituent parts. And since then, the national question, as opposed to the class-based contradiction, has been the question, the perennial question, the unanswered question. And I think that's what you just said. And we look at it right now and we see that the national question, and that's what I say, not the ethnic, but the national question is important.
Why did the students go for Marxism? Why did the DER go for Marxism? It was to overcome, transcend the ethnic, the national issue by saying we are all workers under a worker state. You remember the classic was that once you have the socialist state, the socialist revolution, the other things would simply dissolve by themselves, because this is a derivative of the class issue. And the students wanted that. And the DER wanted that. That became as I said before in the lecture, the analytical, the identity now of how to deal with the national question, which was at the very top of the political agenda. What Lenin did break the taboo. It was a historical moment. The taboo was you didn't talk about ethnicity or nationality differences. Ethiopia was completely taboo. The students began to argue about this. I was present. In fact, I presided, because the debates were in English, presided over a meeting of Ethiopian students who the topic was Ethiopia we mano. Ethiopian, who is he?
Mm-hmm.
So all sorts of things went back and fiery debate, and at the end they decided the true Ethiopian is the peasant. They sidelined it, Boromo peasant, what other peasant, but it's the peasant. You see how the thing works. It was a decision, it was both an ideological position, but also a position they saw as the solution to the immediate problem. It was the solution to evade the question of nationality, which of course did not go away. But again, Ezekiel, the question of nationality is one of the great failures of Marxism.
Right.
They were never able to deal with it, and it proved to be more persistent than class. Whenever you have this supposition, class to nationality, nationality also always won.
Yeah, that book, when I came to college, that was the first book that was given to us as freshmen. I don't remember that I understood it at that time, but it's a book in which you really dissected the old regime and showed the anatomy of a traditional polity that was parading as a modern state.
Yes, because at that time, Haile Selassie had a great reputation worldwide as a modernizing autocrat. Somebody wrote a book on that, modernizing autocrat. And of course, he did up to a point, but he stifled any kind of progress that threatened his personal power and the control of the center.
Now, let's move on to the culmination of your work, which is your recent book, the most recent book. As I say, that is Ethiopia, Anatomy of the Traditional Polity, and now the last two frontiers in the process of national integration or the process of nation building as a solution to the question of national integration. I think this book could accurately be characterized as a synthesis of your scholarship. So let's begin by looking at this center periphery, which was extant in the anatomy, but was refined, was further refined in the last two frontiers. Can you clarify the centers and the peripheries of the Ethiopian political formation as it is conceived in your latest book? How is it different from
in
the
the context of state building? You see, in time I came to realize, looking at the conflict in the Horn, and what are they struggling about, what they're fighting about, what they're saying they are fighting about. Every Somali, Oromo, Eritreans, Tigrayans, etc., wanted to create their own political structure and dominate it. So I thought, and I read then about, this is standard experience in Europe. All the wars in Europe were fought in this context of building states. And the empires were a good example, model for the Ethiopian Empire. How to look at the Ethiopian Empire, look at the British Empire, the French Empire, etc. It was quite the same. Expanding from a powerful center into a vacuum or relative vacuum around it, conquering, and then beginning to transfer surplus value, surplus land, whatever it is, into the center, and that's how the Europeans became wealthy and industrialized, etc. Ethiopia did the same thing, but the only thing they could transfer was land, not by bringing it, by bringing the population over, and the labor power of the local people. So they put this thing to work together quite successfully in a colonial type of system, bringing the Neftenians down to the south. And it seemed to me this is a very good example, and looked at how empires are ruled. And it's a clear system that you have. It's like a wheel with the center and periphery around it. And the wheel has certain spokes. Each one goes from the center to one colony, because all of them have various colonies. But the wheel doesn't have a thing on the outside. So each unit in the periphery deals only with the center. It does not deal with other units around it. So they're politically isolated. So, and you rule, the other thing is having auxiliary elite who administer it for the center. All the empires used the local people, the Indians, the Africans, whatever you have, as local rulers and rewarded them. And this is what the Ethiopian Empire did. They had the Balabats, local people who were paid, rewarded one way or another, to administer the decisions made at the center. So it was a perfect example, a perfect model. Nation building, starting with an imperial system and then moving along to integrate the periphery, socially, economically, culturally, as much as possible, and Ethiopia has done that. I say in the book that the highland periphery is largely integrated now, linguistically, economically, socially, in every sense. There's no distance between people anymore, between the various nationalities. The one area of integration that has not taken place is the political sphere. The center controls, makes decisions. The local people now, the new local, the OPDOs, the people in the PPRDF parties, they administer. But center remains concentrated in the center. And this is an unstable system by definition. You have an imbalance. How long can this last? I don't know. But my wish for Ethiopia is that this distance will close gradually, that center and periphery will become equal. Politically, power will be equally shared. But this is not happening yet. Why? I call it a frontier because it has never happened. It's not an Ethiopian experience. So they don't know how to go about it. It's a frontier, it's a jungle they have to cross. My hope is that they will cross it at some point.
Yeah.
And then Ethiopia will become a stable, politically integrated system. It doesn't have to be democracy. I don't care what it is, as long as it has the support of the majority of the people, that they see it as legitimate and they are loyal to it. I don't care what system it is.
So you look at three successive regimes and see which regime crossed the periphery, to what extent that regime crossed the periphery. For the purpose of clarity of our viewers, you're saying that there are two peripheries. There is the highland periphery and there is the lowland periphery. On the highland periphery, it's been economically, socially, and to some extent culturally, it's integrated. But politically, it's not. But the lowland periphery is not integrated at all, economically, socially, politically. And this is what poses a danger to the whole body politic or the project of nation building. So is that a clear characterization of two peripheries?
It is. That has made the book difficult to follow, I think, in many cases. The two peripheries, one, the highland periphery, where even before the Ethiopians came, there was a great deal of similarity. Agricultural societies with their own political systems, hierarchical political systems, monotheistic, and in many sense. So it was easier for the integration to take place on the highland. The lowlands were not touched because it was uneconomical to exploit them. They could not exploit them. Pastoralists, they make no surplus, they cannot be taxed, they move around, they cannot be policed, they are all Muslims, they have the relatives just across the border, and Haile Selassie's the regime never tried to do anything. Occasionally they would raid and take cattle and camels from them. Other than that, and the people there, they didn't even know which country they lived in. The Derg began some kind of integration by creating these cadre systems and introducing the rudimentary system of Kabbales and other things, which of course they never took root. And of course the people there couldn't understand what you're talking about, what's Marxism and the rest of it. And of course, for this, because of this reason, the lowland periphery politically important. One is they always look across the border, they don't look towards Addis Ababa, they have relatives, they have all sorts of things across the border. They economically interact with across the border, not with inside. So even economically, the lowland is not integrated. The other thing is, because they feel so distant from the state, all the rebellious movements started by recruiting pastoralists, and they started from there. Even today, they are still work that way. So by not having control of the periphery, administratively or in any other way, they could not stop these rebellions. You start a rebellion, you can go on forever. You just jump across the border and you stay there waiting. Today, there is an Anuak liberation movement in Pochala, across the border.
Yeah.
Sometimes they raid in Gambela. They kill a few people, then they themselves get killed, etc. So it's still there, it's still happening. The EPRDF made the most important intervention in the lowlands. And this is because economically they became important, or they are perceived as economically important. New technology has brought that land, which was considered infertile and useless, now he brought it into production with water, because all the rivers cross the lowlands. So it's now become very important. And also, one thing is agricultural development there, and the other is minerals. Not much has been discovered so far, but there's a frenetic search for minerals. So suddenly, the ignored poor lowlands have become the center of attention. Now, what's happened there? The state had a very light touch on them until recently. There was no police. I remember in South Homo, there were 500 policemen for I don't know how many millions of people living there. They have no cars, they have nothing. So if there was a problem, the local people were, the police or the others were there to settle it according to customary law. They have no law. They don't go according to Ethiopian law or any other kind of law. So the touch of the state was quite light. Now, however, in order to exploit those resources there, they have to take vast amounts of land in that leasing program. And they have to displace the population. That is a very explosive situation. And my concern is this. So far, the PRDF has ruled with a fairly mild hand. Unless it's opposed directly, it doesn't use heavy force. However, it's going to be opposed down there, and then they will have to use very heavy force to maintain control of that plantation system they are setting up. And of course, when the state starts using force, it doesn't discriminate who uses it again. It's against everybody. Even the people in the same, the Tigrayans and the Amharas in this case, they have no more rights than the people in Gambela have. So everybody will suffer. And this is why I stress the lowland periphery thing, because it impacts on the whole state periphery, central periphery situation, and also on every Ethiopian.
So yeah, that's clear why, for instance, Gambela and Benishangul is more important than the highland, because the regime's survival in terms of extraction of resources, it's become the lowland with, as you said, the leased land to foreign investors and politically connected local investors that become the center of attention economically. All right. But I have a question for you in regard to your analysis in the book. That is, historically, the real threat to the survival of the regime came from the highland periphery rather than the lowland periphery. I can understand that it's become economically more important today. But I think that in the highland periphery, the failure of political integration of the periphery on the highland, that means the Oromo, the Sidama, which constitute about 50% of the population, unless they are politically integrated, unless the question of nationalities is addressed in a genuine manner, not in a window dressing manner, that would be a threat. That would continue to be a threat to the survival of the regime. Do you think that you downplayed the highland periphery in the book?
No, not at all. Not at all. Ethiopia, everybody calls it a unstable regime or a fragile state because of this. Because of this. The lack of legitimacy that a regime has renders it unstable. Where the resistance comes from, you're right, it comes from the highlands also, and the lowlands. It comes. It flares up, it dies out. What it does is it does not allow the center to relax, to relax security, to relax the things that are done all the time by the security, by the army, by the government itself. And this impacts on everybody. I keep saying this. Ethiopian citizens may think that they are better off than the Gamelas, but they never had political rights either. So I'm in a sense, you're right that I'm to a certain extent discount the opposition from the periphery.
The highland periphery.
The highland periphery, because it was so easily outmaneuvered by the EPRDF and, of course, completely discarded. But that doesn't mean that it will not happen again. It will not happen again. As long as you have not crossed the political frontier, it's always a danger, yes.
Okay. I make observations when I travel there, and from what I observed, politically speaking, the architecture that was put in place to rule under the EPRDF is not cohesive anymore. It's kind of relaxing. It's every interest group in that coalition is pulling the other way. That means, as you just said, the center cannot hold if it doesn't apply force, tremendous amount of force. Now, in that context, I want to ask you this question. The Ethiopian military, I see it as politically highly connected, heavily armed, and now economically powerful. It's an active player. Do you think that would make the military, if the political system doesn't remain as cohesive as it was designed to be in the absence of the linchpin architect of the system, you think that there is a danger for applying more force in order to keep both peripheries?
Well, it's happened before.
Huh?
It's happened before. So it could happen again, yes. You cannot rule that. And it's true that this is a highly politicized military. I mean, it is the descendant of a political movement, an insurgent political movement. Yes, it could happen.
Okay, so more force. But more force doesn't hold the whole thing together. Force has never, it would work temporarily, but legitimacy is what is important for a political system. Force alone, the coercive power of the state alone cannot hold the nation together.
For stability, obviously, force is not, you use force because you don't have stability, you don't have legitimacy, obviously. Yeah, and the military think for a while that they don't need legitimacy. although they try to win it by calling them National Survival Council and all this, but it doesn't wash anymore. And eventually, yes, an unstable situation cannot last forever, no.
Okay. As we said at the beginning, you say in the first book, in the second book, and now here, that the national question is really at the top of the political demands. If this is not addressed in a genuine manner, that is, for instance, the federalism that is in place structurally, if it doesn't function as it is designed, then the fate of the country would be in question, that it has to be addressed. Do you think that the new regional elites, the so-called balabats, the new balabats as you call them, the new regional elites, are they the result of the empowerment of the historically marginalized and disadvantaged peoples, or are just this political pawns through which the regime rules? Are they really empowered, the new regional elites, the PDOs, that is? To what extent are they autonomous? Let me put it this way: the fact that the new chief executive of Ethiopia is from one of the smallest ethnic and religious groups, does that represent a real milestone, or what do you say about the current political arrangement for the center to continue to wield power over the peripheries?
I think the center is still controlling decision-making process, but it has, again, as before, delegated administrative power, but at this time massively administrative power. This delegation, it has great material rewards, which these OPDO people are gathering. They are becoming a new peripheral elite on the basis of material, not just office, because they're kicked out of office fairly frequently, but they accumulate wealth. And they have a vested interest in that system being maintained. The system as it is now. They are beneficiaries of the system. And they will side to defend it. So they're not jokers that you can discard like that. They are part of a system.
Okay, so
what my hope is seeing the evolution over the three regimes, moving towards a solution, and of course very hesitantly and still holding on to the center exclusive power, that there will be another step in the future and bring integration closer. The first step into the frontier, into the political frontier. History seems to be moving in that way.
All right, my final question. In the book, you write, and I'm quoting you here, at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the incumbent regime in Addis Ababa is engaged in the same battles that exhausted its predecessors, impoverished the country, and blasted people's hopes for peace, democracy, and an escape from dire poverty. Now, I understand this to mean that the government's failure to devolve power in accordance with the principles enshrined in the country's constitution, and its failure to institute power sharing between the center and the periphery may eventually lead to its fall and possibly the disintegration of the nation state. Correct me if I misunderstood this.
This is what it says, or this is what you are asking?
What I said was that the incumbent regime in Addis Ababa, this is your words, engaging in the same battles that exhausted its predecessors, impoverished the country, and blasted people's hopes for peace, democracy, and escape from dire poverty. End of quote. Now, I understand this to mean that the government's failure to devolve power in a genuine manner, in accordance with the principles enshrined in the Constitution, and to institute power sharing between the center and the periphery, first, first possibility is it might lead to the fall of the regime as it did to its predecessors. Secondly, it might even lead to the disintegration of the nation state itself, because now we are at the end of 100 years old of attempts at national integration. If this federal system falls, what remains is disintegration. Am I misunderstanding you?
No. What I said is faces the same battles. It's a war with Eritrea. It's a war with Somalia. It's a bad situation all around. There are national liberation movements all around the border. So what has been solved? The dangers are still there, and this is why the center still is unstable. Now, will the dangers go away if there is change, if they cross the political frontier? Possibly not. The Somali may still want to leave Ethiopia. Possibly not. Somali may still want to leave Ethiopia. The Eritreans may still resent their position, and they're on war footing.
Yeah.
So what has been solved from these battles on the front? Food, economically, food aid is a structural component of the economy. Now they say that things have improved very fast, I don't know. But you have a basic structural problem, which is a population that has grown for 15 million to nearly 100, using not the same amount of land, but less, because it's eroding, less land with the same technology. Now this is an impossible thing. You follow what I'm saying? The peasants are still using the plow. The technology cannot change. The shares of land they use are getting smaller and smaller. In Tigray, the regional government voted not to divide land anymore. That problem has not been resolved. They tried, I think, very aggressively to resolve this with the Tanagawa program in the early years of the 90s, new seeds, fertilizers, etc., etc. If you remember, they failed because they applied the same program throughout the country as they usually do, campaign style. It works some places did not work. I think from land to the tiller, now they have gone to the land to the leaseholder.
Investor.
The faith now in promoting agricultural development is put on foreign capital and imported technology. They may succeed, I don't know. But the main problem, domestic production, remains and is aggravated. Same technology, less land, triple the population to live off that same land. That has not been resolved. And this is what I was referring, some of the main obstacles. There was starvation in Ethiopia a few years ago.
As I say, this book is about synthesis, and this is the benefit of half a century long observation of the political scene. Now, you went to Ethiopia in the mid-1960s at a time when many African new nations were emerging. And you studied Ethiopian and African politics, and particularly the Horn of Africa politics, now for half a century. Now, what did you find? What are the recurring themes? This is really a dire picture. It doesn't seem that the questions that the demands of the populace that were extant at the time have not been resolved. They're still there, as you just said. What are the recurring themes in terms of politics in Ethiopia in particular, the Horn of Africa in general?
Well, now at the end of this of this lifetime, I am coming to think that the biggest mistake that was made in Africa is to accept the Western model, to expect that Africa will become westernized and will equal the West. A great, great mistake. This is still being pushed on the Africans. Africans have no knowledge production at all. I've not heard of an African come up with an African idea for African problems in the last 30 years or so. Africans are dependent on the import of knowledge. Where does the knowledge come? The West. There will always be second-rate Westerners. To me, this is a historical tragedy, and it's the perpetuation of Western hegemony, which is now spreading throughout the world. It cannot be stopped. Now it's a global system. Africans are tortured by this. Basically, they are divided into the most horrible way. Colonials, when they left, they gave the power to a very small minority of the population, the urban, westernized minority, living at a very high level of affluence, to rule over vast bulks of peasants who live in the traditional sphere. This has not changed. So Africa is being split between a minority, an urban minority, which is westernized, and itself now has assimilated the Western ethic and values, and is trying to impose it on its own people. And it meets with resistance everywhere. Desperate resistance. And perhaps this is historically ordained, I don't know, historically determined, but it's a deeply divided country, not only ethnically and nationally and class, etc. It's divided between external intervention, which is massive, in every way. There are more foreigners in Ethiopia, NGOs, etc., telling people what to do, how to solve the problems, what to think, where to send the children. So you have African children going to a kindergarten to start learning another language, to become alienated from their own families, from their own villages, from their own culture. Nobody's teaching them African culture or their own culture. Nobody is. So what do you expect these children to become? Or the children are in America. There's hardly an Ethiopian family that doesn't have 1 or 2 or 3 children in America. They lost that child. They lost that generation. So who is going to guide Africa to a new path of autonomous development, independent thinking? So I think if I see anything worth opposing or debating is this, that Africans must start thinking about the future. Where are they being led to? And a lot of the problems we are talking about, stem from this. Stem from adopting a model which is totally unsuited to Africa. An economic model, a cultural model, political, no. Africans have never adopted democracy. They play with it. It's a facade. And to some extent, I applaud this. They go through elections, they have parliaments, they never pay attention to them. They have regimes that go for 30, 40, 50 years. Good. That's what they do. That's what they do. I have nothing to say about that. So it's sad in a way that it's a political sphere that the model has been broken down completely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if I say thank you for the interview, it would not be enough, but thank you for...
Oh, it'll be more than enough. It's my pleasure to talk about these things. Yes.
It's a pleasure to conclude with this notion that we need African solutions to African problems. And when it comes to Ethiopia, I think the main questions are questions of democracy, development, and peace building. And on that one, I know the Oromo people have an Oromo solution to Ethiopian problem on democracy, on development, and peace building. But thanks for your insight, for your guidance, and for your instruction. Thank you so much.
It's thanks to you too.